Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX14 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new pair of Ace in the Day gameplays for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the SBD-3 Dauntless, an American dive bomber coming to tier of 1 and a batter rating of 2.0. For the purposes of today's historical overview, I'll be covering the Dauntless from its conception through to this particular variant of it. With that, let's begin. Upon entering service for the United States Navy in the spring of 1938, the Northrop BT-1 two-seat dive bomber proved to be unsuccessful in service due to its poor handling characteristics. To fix this issue, Northrop began to work on the successor, XBT-2 prototype design. Whilst the design was undergoing development, Northrop as an aviation company went through a major change, in that the company, Northrop Corporation, was taken over by Douglas Aircraft in 1938, becoming a subsidiary. This led to the XBT-2 design being redesignated as the XSBD-1, noting that the design was now for a scout bomber, as the United States Navy wanted to preserve the bomber designation for multi-engine bomber type aircraft only. When the prototype underwent its first flight by early April 1939, the XSBD-1 had become a much different aircraft than the preceding BT-1, in that the engine had been changed from a Pratt & Whitney R1535-94 twin wasp 825 horsepower radial engine to the more powerful 1000 horsepower Wright Cyclone XR1820-32 radial engine. The partially retracted landing gear of the BT-1 had been replaced with fully retractable landing gear. There was the introduction of hydraulically actuated perforated dive brakes above and below the trailing edge of the wing, and there was also the provision of arrestor gear so that the plane could operate from an aircraft carrier. The success of the plane's test flight program saw a production order for 57 SBD-1s and 87 SBD-2s placed on the 8th of April 1939. The difference in the variants was that the SBD-1 was the United States Marine variant, whilst the SBD-2 was the United States Navy variant, which carried extra fuel in order to extend the plane's range to 1,200 nautical miles. Both plane variants were armed with an offensive armament of one 12.7mm M2 Browning machine gun and one 7.62mm Browning machine gun, both being mounted in the nose as taken from the preceding BT-1. The plane could also carry up to a single 1,600 pound or 726 kg bomb under the central fuselage and a 100 pound bomb or 45 kg bomb under each wing. The SBD-1 entered service with the United States Marines in June of 1940, whereas the SBD-2 entered service with the United States Navy at the start of December 1941, just before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor as of the 7th of December 1941. The improved SBD-3 variant, as seen on screen today, entered service in March of 1942, seeing the introduction of self-sealing fuel tanks, armour protection, a bulletproof cockpit windscreen, the uprated 1000 horsepower Wright R1820-52 Cyclone radial engine, and the standardisation of the offensive armament to a pair of 12.7mm M2 Browning machine guns in the nose. Additionally, the radio operator in the rear cockpit was now provided with a defensive pairing of two 7.62mm Browning machine guns, this defensive armament being standard for all future SBD variants. The SBD-4 variant was practically the same as the SBD-3, albeit with a 24-volt electrical system rather than 12 volts, entering service in October of 1942. The next major variant would be the SBD-5, which arrived in February of 1943. In combat service, the most notable success of the SBD-3 variant was during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. On the 4th of June specifically, 4 squadrons of SBD-3s successfully sunk the Japanese aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu. As for the machine gun pods which you are seeing in game, the concept of increasing the SBD's armament was a key area of development throughout the design's life. One of the proposed modifications was the addition of a pod carrying two 12.7mm M2 Browning machine guns under each wing. There are images available showing this modification fitted to the plane, but I have found no notable record of the pods ever being used in combat service. Therefore, with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at how the SBD-3 Dauntless handles in the skies of War Thunder Arcade. Our first gameplay for today is brought to you from the ground strike map Berlin Suburbs. For this we'll be using the following setup. Stealth belts are offensive machine guns, the reason being twofold. Firstly, these are the most powerful belts on offer in my experience, and secondly, the lack of traces in these belts means that we conceal the fact that we've opted to take the underwing machine gun pods as our secondary armament. The only time our foes are going to find out that we've made this configuration choice is if they have a look at the scoreboard mid-game, alternatively when we open fire on them and chew up their fuselage. Our gun convergence for our offensive machine guns is set to 700 metres. This all revolving around the concept of engaging our foes at distance. On the first hand, when we're going up against enemy bombers and trying to intercept them, we'll typically find that enemy bombers are able to match us for pace if not outrun us, so a longer distance convergence is going to work well in bringing down these foes at longer distances. As for when we're going up against enemy fighters, the other side of the coin will find that they'll want to try and force us into a turn fight, and we'll want to in return try to use our superior burst mass while the highest at the battle rating to bring them down in a head-on before they can successfully initiate the turn fight. As for our defensive machine guns, we are taking the armoured target belts, as these are the most powerful out of those on offer. And as for our fuel load, we are taking the standard 30-minute fuel load to ensure we can make it to the end of the game unscathed on fuel capacity. Now I should point out in this first gameplay, what you're seeing is the Dauntless when it's the top battle rating aircraft, and there's a large array of battle rating 1.3 and 1.7 aircraft fighting it out below us at this point. The logic here being this is going to govern our overall playstyle, as the majority of our opposition will not be able to outrun us as such, or outperform us in terms of boom and zoom to the point where we feel threatened by them using boom and zoom against us, but instead they're going to outperform us massively in the turn fighter department and be able to run rings around us if they get us into such a situation. So in return, we're going to be using straight line tactics, attacking them aggressively via boom and zoom, straight line interception, or forcing them in the head to heads, such as say 5M4, ripping them to pieces very quickly. And now carrying our momentum through to the IG Val, setting up a chain kill here, heading towards them, and we can note the rather abysmal vertical energy retention of the Dauntless coming into play, where we're struggling to gain ground on the IG Val, but we're just doing enough to get close enough to rip them apart at a distance of 865 metres, taking off their right hand wing. That's the importance of the longer distance gun convergence setting, and the other important item is the fact that you've got two nose mounted machine guns which are not convergence reliant and rely purely on your accuracy at aiming at the foe. Now we were hoping to take down the enemy H6K as well, but we can see that our friendly Pea shooters done an admirable job of bringing them down by themselves. Congratulations to them. And we carry our momentum through here to the Key 21 Mark 1 and we'll try to rip them apart for another kill. And then going through this process, let's firstly talk about the vertical energy retention. The vertical energy retention of the Dauntless is abysmal in the fact that if you start off at an altitude of 3,000 metres and a speed of 300 km an hour and go into a 1,000 metre dive, a dead 90-degree dive, you'll have difficulty in regaining 75% of the altitude that you've sacrificed. If you get to 2,750 metres, you will be forced to level out because you'll be hitting your stall speed of 125 km an hour at this point in time. So vertical energy retention, and we should point out that's a return climb angle of 30 degrees and will emergency powerfully engage, your vertical energy retention is not going to be doing you any favours. So instead, going for those long passes through opposition and setting up those chains of targets is going to be key to getting the most out of this plane when you're going for those diving attacks. Now on the plus side, when you do go into a dive, your dive speed acceleration is average and comparable to a good number of fighters that you're going to see, such as the P-36 Hawks and even the Spitfire Mark 1A at a battle rating 2.3. The only downside of your dive speed acceleration is once you hit 700 km an hour, you hit a massive cliff in terms of acceleration and your acceleration falls off very quickly, all the way up to your maximum dive speed of 782 km an hour, which is decent at the battle rating, particularly when you're facing lower battle rating aircraft, like the biplanes and the early monoplane fighters. But in return, if we take a look at energy retention across the other two domains, another key aspect is the fact that your straight line energy retention, for the purposes of a scenario as what you're seeing right now, is good. In that against enemy biplanes and early monoplanes, your straight line energy retention means you hold your speed from 430 km an hour going downwards, and they'll be doing roughly the same. Where it's a downside is when you're facing higher battle rating opposition, as we'll see in the second gameplay, in the fact that your straight line energy retention in this regard is abysmal, with a considerable number of fighters and aircraft in general holding their speed above 500 km an hour much more easily in a straight line compared to your own aircraft. So it plays off very heavily depending on what you're facing at the time. Hence why I've emphasised it once at the start of this. I'll continue to emphasise it in the second gameplay as well. Now to this point, as we make our way back in towards the centre, we can see that the abysmal climb rate of this plane is coming into play. In that if you start off at 300 km an hour and try to climb at a climb angle at 25 degrees using more emergency power, you'll only be able to gain approximately 350 metres altitude before you'll be forced to level out, while your plane's speed having dropped to 195 km an hour approximately. This means you can only conduct very short sprints of climb, or very short bursts, but you'll not be able to gain considerable amounts of altitude over time, unless you go through a whole string of sprints, levelling out and sprinting once again. So instead we're only gaining enough altitude to get ourselves in a position to be competitive in going into these head-to-heads, either key 45, now key 10, and we're going to carry our momentum through on another kill chain here towards the F-222.2 bomber. We can see how quickly we can rip them apart, setting both engines on fire, and we're going to try to finish them off in the sky, but if not we'll leave them in such a crippled state that they'll crash into the ground over time, and we'll carry our momentum through towards the key 45. Now this lack of climb rate shouldn't be seen as a weakness in terms of getting yourself into the right position to be able to engage your foes. There will of course be those foes that climb well above you and out of your control, such as the MB-174 bomber that's roaming around at approximately 3,000 meters altitude right now, bombing our base. But you have to keep it in mind, you'll have to engage the foes that are ahead of you and at the same altitude as you or below you. You cannot afford to go for those foes well above you, so because you don't have the reach to do so. Even with the overall range extended to you thanks to your machine gun armament, you just don't have that reach in terms of performance. As we pick off the key 45 Coke, the second of the two we've downed in this sequence, and the F-222 bomber is about to crash into the ground. Now one thing to note about the armament of this plane, something that's perhaps not as obvious, is it's actually rather frustrating in terms of the ammunition count across the different machine gun pairings. Now in the nose you have 360 rounds in total, or 180 per gun, whereas in the wings you have 360 rounds per machine gun in the pods. This means you're going to exhaust your nose machine gun ammunition much more quickly than your wing mounted machine gun ammunition. Now why can this be a problem? Well think, if you're using a longer distance convergence setting, what you're using the nose mounted machine guns to do is firstly work at longer distances, as explained previously, but also to make up the gap at the closer distances, because the convergence setting of your underwing machine guns means that you'll have difficulty in hitting targets squarely when they're only say 250 meters from you, as we bring down the key 27 here and head on for a double strike. So instead, when you're aiming for targets at closer ranges, if you do not have the nose-mounted machine guns available because they're on a reload, instead what you'll need to do is aim off-centre to bring the wing-mounted machine guns to bear. And this in turn can cause some frustration if you're not used to this, and the fact that you can hold down the trigger and completely miss the target for some unknown reason because you're not anticipating this fact. We're going after the key 27 here, the second in the chain, but we're not catching them. We can see the slow nature of the Dauntless. Instead what we'll potentially do is just follow our key 44 behind, that way to support them, as we're going to take out an armoured car as well. That's something you can do with this armament layout, is strafe the light vehicles, and by supporting our teammates here we can either bring down the key 27 ourselves or just assist in that regard. Neither being required here as our friendly key 44 scored the kill very nicely. And now we carry our momentum through into the centre of the map, going for a reload. But before we can do that, we note a key 10 coming from spawn, and what we decide to do at this point is, because we clocked onto them so early, is just simply fly away. Now they are going to catch up to us over time, but the idea being here we've got a good number of friendlies quite close by, as you'll see me observe, and we're going to let the key 10 completely focus on us, and our friendlies are going to pick up the kill to cover us. Now making our way away here, what else is there to note in terms of what you're seeing in this first gameplay? Well, one thing we haven't really covered is durability. Now the durability of the SBD-3 Dauntless is very good for its battle rating. This plane can take considerable punishment, as one may suppose for a naval aircraft, in that the fuselage can withstand a considerable amount of machine gun fire, whether it be light or heavy caliber, and can even take a considerable number of 20mm cannon shells compared to what you'll be facing. In return, however, there are two downsides. The engine seems to be susceptible to taking damage regardless of where it's head-to-head engagements, alternatively from being shot from behind or above, and on top of that you'll find that the wing-mounted fuel tanks are susceptible to catching fire when hit by incendiary rounds, and when they do catch fire they have a tendency to keep burning until the plane falls out the sky, and this is something you'll have to deal with. Alternatively, the best bet of course is not to get hit on the wings where possible and just try to take shots on the central fuselage, which is the strongest component. You can see there we briefly used our dive brakes to manage our speed on the I-15 in coming down them, picking up our double A's as the game is about to come to its end. Trying to get the SB2M here, but I think time's just about to run out before we can get the kill shot. Yep, it does indeed. It's time for us to take a look at the post-game stats. With our double ace and single ground target destroyed, we're able to pick up 26,744 silver lions and 2,958 research points. In this first gameplay, we've hopefully demonstrated how the SBD-3 Dauntless can be absolutely ferocious when it's the top battle rating aircraft, so long as it keeps its opponents in front of its machine guns. As soon as the foes get behind it, that's where the story completely flips, and this plane is going to be rather vulnerable. As whilst it does have the defensive machine gunner, they're only going to last for so long, while the defensive machine gunner being exposed in their rearward position and knocked out rather easily. and once they're gone, it means that your opponents are going to have a free rein in bringing you down, as you won't be able to pull away rather rapidly with a comparable engine performance of your plane to that of your opponents, albeit your engine performance is anemic compared to them and they will catch you in the long haul. So instead, you need to pick your attacks right in terms of timing and also the chain of kills to go for, make your cut for enemy territory and then break out whilst you got the opportunity to do so, flying towards your friendly so that way they can cover your 6 if you have some opponents who are trying to chase after you, or the fact that you'll have a small advantage in the speed you initially take when you're diving away from enemy territory. This means in terms of defeating the SBD-3 Dauntless when you're a lower battle rating aircraft such as a Gladiator, an A5M4 or a P-36A Hawk, you'll need to get close to its 6, avoid the head-on wherever possible, but force it into a turn fight and stay on its 6 and keep pounding in the rounds until eventually the aircraft does go down. It can be a bit of a grind, with the Dauntless being a rather durable aircraft, but in the end you'll see it catch fire, alternatively pieces will start falling off and the plane will fall out of the sky in return. Now we're going to move on to our second gameplay of today, where we're going to see the Dauntless as well as the bottom battle rating aircraft in a battle rating 2.7 to 3.0 game. And in return what this means is we no longer have the ability to rely on our ability to perform roughly equal or not too far behind our opponents in the engine department. Instead we're going to see a number of foes that can outmaneuver us in the first instance, a number of foes that can solely outperform us in the engine department in terms of acceleration and climb rate, and then those foes that can outperform us in both regards, an example being a Spitfire Mark 1A, and in return we'll have to deal with those foes and see how we can use our firepower to our advantage. For our final gameplay of today, we're on the ground strike map Cliff Coast using the same setup as before, but we immediately must come on to the maximum altitude limits for this aircraft, of which there are 3. The first is war emergency power. In at 3,500 metres altitude, the war emergency power for this plane greys out, compromising its output by 50%. The net impact of this is your ability to bolster your abysmal acceleration in a straight line from the 300 km/h limit on engine power alone to 350 km/h with war emergency power is compromised somewhat, and it means that accelerating in general only becomes more cumbersome. And on top of that, you cannot assist your climb rate as much with war emergency power at higher altitudes. The second domain is with regards to control surfaces, where at 5,000 metres altitude you'll find that your elevator in particular becomes heavier, and it means it's more difficult to pull off manoeuvres such as loops, alternatively hard turns. Whereas with regards to the third domain, i.e. your straight line engine performance, you'll find that in terms of straight line acceleration, it begins to drop off at 5,500 metres altitude, and this also has a slight knock-on effect in terms of your climb rate. Now as we go to altitude, as we're seeing here, what we need to do in the opening instance of the match is try to get above our opposition, or get into a position where we can try to pick a target we can engage before our foes start to get above us. Because now when we're going up against higher battle rating opposition, what we must consider is the maps start to get larger, and on top of that our opponent's performance starts to get to the point where they can outclimb us to altitude. Now of course we do have the bomber spawn, which gives us an intrinsic advantage, but over time that advantage is going to drop away rather rapidly, especially when we see the likes of say a Heinkel 100D1 or a KI-44. So instead what we need to focus on here is our ability to get into a position to be able to at least fight our foes on fair terms in the first instance, and then consider our options afterwards. And what are the opponents who have climbed being the PE-3, the Hurricane and the P-36? These planes are not the best climbers at their respective battle ratings, meaning that we have the ability to at least pick one foe we can go for. And indeed it actually appears as though our opposition is more focused on bringing down our bombers, and will pick the enemy aircraft which is actually converging towards our position, what with our bomber being relatively close. In this case it's the enemy Sea Hurricane Mark 1B, who is converging towards our Martin 167A3, and also one of our other bombers off to our left hand side who we haven't seen on screen. So instead we're now diving down towards the Hurricane, and we're going to be using our dive brakes in order to manage our approach speed, something you can do rather nicely in this aircraft as the dive brakes are rather strong. And as we manage our speed, we do compromise our ability to make the resurge in terms of the zoom part of a boom and zoom pass, but in return we get more time on target and we can be more accurate in bringing down the foe in a single pass. So it's a trade-off, but one that's welcome. We now come around, but having gone for this single pass on the Sea Hurricane, we can see that the enemy P3 in particular is now above us, and we also have to consider the enemy Junkers 87 is well above us, both of these planes being at roughly 5,000 metres if not higher, and these are planes we can no longer touch unless we decide to dedicate the entirety of our game to trying to get to altitude to attack these enemy aircraft. But in the case of the P3 in particular, they'll be wise to do this over time most likely, and it means they can put themselves in a prime position to shoot us down, where the P3 haven't clocked onto our incoming presence and now getting ready to use boom and zoom tactics against us. Now what we're going to try and do is go into a gradual dive and force the PE3 to follow us into the dive as we convert it into a spiral downwards to try and get them into a turn fight. That way we can force them to overshoot and get onto their 6. But the PE3 pilot, as we're about to see, is having none of it. They're just going to use a quick boom and zoom pass to make sure we go down to lower altitude. And they've actually pushed us right onto the path of an encroaching H-75A1 or the French Hawk, who is just as manoeuvrable as us in terms of turn circle and more manoeuvrable across the control surface domains, and it means what we need to do here is use our air brakes in order to force the Curtiss Hawk closer and closer to our plane and eventually overshoot. And if we can get them close enough, they'll be right in the firing line of our rearward facing machine gun, and it means we can try to knock out their pilot. And here we do so, albeit with a little bit of a delay by the looks of things. Now what's also important to note, you may not have noticed it the first time in a dogfight, but the fact that we originally had our combat flaps deployed, and when we tried to use our air brakes or our dive brakes, we found that we could not extend them. That's because the dive brakes and the flaps of this aircraft are all part of the same mechanism, so when you have one active you cannot activate the other, and this can catch you out on occasions, as it did me almost there, and I only realised it in the nick of time, so this is something to be wary of. But having now been relegated down to lower altitudes, let's talk about the manoeuvrability of this plane. Within its ideal altitude range between ground level and 3,500 metres altitude, where I personally feel you'll be at your maximum performance across all domains, and then you're not going to be compromised by the graying out of your war emergency power above 3,500 metres altitude in particular, you'll find that the turn circle of this aircraft is comparable to the likes of the Curtiss P-36 Hawks, and on top of that just a little bit shy of the likes of the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1A. In turn, this means you can outturn in the horizontal a large number of enemy aircraft, starting with Messerschmitt 109 ML4s, A-36s, Yakovlev Yak-1s, you get the picture. This can catch a lot of foes by surprise, but at the same time do be wary for the likes of say the K-44, which is going to be able to turn with you once it's got a bit of speed, albeit because you're going to be the slower aircraft, then you can force your opposition to overshoot. We're making our way towards the CR-32 here, where the I-153 gradually making their way into the deep blue. Perhaps they've got engine difficulty, and we're going to assist our Heinkel 100 in bringing down the manoeuvrable biplane. But outside of turn circle, in terms of the free control surface domains, let's start with the strongest, and that is your rudder. Your rudder is reasonably powerful in the fact that compared to a standard fighter at your battle rating, it's average and can enable you at lower speeds, particularly below 275 km/h, to conduct a rather nice and tight flat rudder turn. It also enables you to conduct some rather interesting hammerhead manoeuvres or just play about on the rudder and even snap roll effectively. The only downside to the rudder is between 550 and 650 km/h you'll lose 50% of its performance. Next up is your roll rate, where you'll find that in general it's on the slow side, but you would expect that for a plane of this size and nature. And between 500 and 600 km/h you'll lose 75% of your roll rate. And finally, coming to the weakest control surface domain, your elevator. In a straight up dogfight you'll find that your elevator is heavy and difficult to manage at times in getting that initial response and forcing this plane into a loop. But conversely, when you go into a high speed and a sharp angle dive, i.e. 70 degrees or more, what you'll find is above 400 km/h the elevator of this plane gains responsiveness up to 75%, whereby you'll be able to pull up on the nose very quick and very easily and force this plane into a loop or just get it out of the dive in the first instance. So this is always something to keep in mind, that when you go into a high speed dive trying to get away from a foe, you can actually conduct a rather nice loop to get them off your 6, or at least shake them out in front of your guns for a limited period of time before they've realised what's going on. And this is rather unique to this plane compared to the fighters that you'll see at the battle rating and tier. But having talked about the control surface domains, we're now making our way back in towards the centre, towards the furball that's occupying the centre of the map. We'll be looking at an A-36 Apache in particular, who's going to take an interest in forcing us into a head-to-head. And we're going to be rather evasive to the head-to-head because they do have 650 caliber machine guns of their own, plus the possibility of their own machine gun pods if I'm not mistaken, and we don't want to get ripped apart, as we'll get cut out the sky if we go into that head-to-head, particularly on our engine, as mentioned in the first game in terms of durability. So instead, we use a snap roll to evade the incoming fire, and we can see how the manoeuvrability of the Dauntless, so long as it stays in the horizontal, gives it an advantage, and we even score a hit as we force our opponent to overshoot. They catch fire on their left hand side, the fire ensues and consumes the entire plane, and we're not going to fish off the A-36, seeing as they're just burning out the sky rather rapidly. We pick up the assist instead. We now carry our momentum downwards because a MiG-3's come up on our 6, a MiG-315, and we snap up onto the 6 of an I-16 Type 18. Scoring a hit, but nothing too clean. It was a rather difficult shot to take in such a short period of time, but now we come around to evade the incoming fire of the MiG-315 once again, only taking some scratch fire towards the rear of our central fuselage, seeing the durability of this plane holding up, and now we come around using our tighter turn circle to gradually gain the advantage in this dogfight. And we can see how, despite its rather large nature and rather cumbersome nature at the controls, the SBD-3 Dauntless is not too bad a turn fighter against certain opposition. And as the MiG goes to longer and longer distances, we pick up the kill as the convergence setting for our machine gun pod starts to come into effect, and we also get the assist on the I-16, now going to a tally of 6 kills in total. Go for another reload here, and what else is there to point out as we now make our way back towards friendly territory? While the exposure points for the SBD-3 Dauntless is where we are currently, in the fact that we just come out of a furball and we're right down towards sea level. Now the problem with this is, the Hurricanes decide to dive on us, and we've clocked onto it at the appropriate time, and they've come in with too much speed in order to be able to get a clean shot on us. But if they manage to approach more carefully, alternatively there been a plane with a much more capable set of control surfaces and a high speed dive compared to the Hurricane, they could have followed us and had a clean shot on target and potentially got us out of the sky. So when you're down at these lower altitudes and forced into a furball, or you decide to go into a furball, you need to be aware of the fact that as you're making your way out, you'll be slow to escape, and on top of that you'll be vulnerable to those above you looking to peck you out of the sky. In making our way away though, making our way safely to the airfield, we're keeping an eye on the Hurricane just in case they try to come around for a last ditch head on, but with so many friendly fighters on them plus the AA of our airfield, it doesn't look as though they're going to make it out alive. In fact, they've just been downed. And we'll continue to make our way out towards the naval targets now, because we reckon there may be an enemy bomber or two coming in for some quick kills. As we make our way away, we can see how, despite the fact this plane is rather heavy on its control surfaces and it is a dive bomber, that it can be a rather comfortable plane to fly. And I must admit, I was surprised how quickly I took to enjoying this plane in terms of its control surfaces, and it really at points didn't feel as though I was flying a dive bomber. It just felt as though I was flying a very heavy fighter or a lot of firepower to bear. Of course, you have to remind yourself of the fact that this is a dive bomber at the end of the day, and it does come with a lot of limitations. And another thing to consider is your ideal speed range. Now, in an ideal environment, I would recommend an ideal speed of 300 to 400 km an hour in going into a dogfight, because then your control surfaces will be at their maximum possible performance. But the difficulty with this is you don't have really the ability to get to in excess of 350 km an hour unless you spend a lot of time flying in a straight line. Alternatively, you can afford to shave off some altitude in a gradual dive to build up said speed. So instead, the ideal speed range that's actually achievable is between 275 and 325 km an hour. Although do keep in mind, as we've seen, the control surfaces are reliable in their performance all the way down to a speed of 200 km an hour. It's only once you go below 175 km an hour that will really start to hang in the air and this plane will become unstable at the controls, meaning that you've got a lot of flexibility in this plane. And what's more, when it does go into a stall at 125 km an hour, your stall recovery is rather fast for a plane of this nature. In that, you can get to 180 km an hour by pointing the nose down rather quickly, and the control surfaces come back to life rather immediately. I mean that being stalled out is not too much of a problem, although there'll be a good number of folks who will try to maximise how much you've stalled out, forcing the angle of your stall to be extreme in order to come down hard on you via Hammerhead, and that was our suspicion with the PE3 from earlier. But as we dive after the enemy havoc here right towards the end of the game, we can see how long it's taken us to close the distance. We won't have enough time to close the distance and the game comes to its end, and it's time for a second set of post-game stats. With our 6 kills and 2 assists, we're able to pick up 11,399 silver lions and 2,256 research points. Whilst in the first game, we demonstrated that to defeat the SBD-3 Dauntless against a lower battle rating opposition, it would be ideal to use turn fighting in planes such as the A5M4, the Heinkel 51, etc. When the SBD-3 Dauntless faces like-for-like battle rating or higher battle rating opposition, turn fighting may not be the best approach, particularly if your plane has a wider turn circle, such as in the case of the MiG-334. But instead, you can use boom and zoom to your advantage, using your outright supremacy in engine performance in terms of both straight line and climb rate performance in order to get above and strike the SBD-3 Dauntless, ripping it to pieces, particularly when it's the lowest of altitudes, close to ground level. Alternatively, if you are forced into a turn fight against this aircraft and you have the wider turn circle in planes such as the MiG-3, the A36, the equivalent of Yak-1, the Typhoon Mark 1A, and etc., what may be best is not only to stay in the turn fight, but force the turn fight into a vertical spiral, because then you'll be playing against the disadvantage that the SBD-3 Dauntless has of poor vertical energy retention, which will cause this plane to head towards a stall a lot faster than your own aircraft. And as a result, you can start to consider hammerheading around and cutting the Dauntless down as they're trying to quickly recover from their stall. But by avoiding such circumstances today in our own SBD-3 Dauntless, hopefully we demonstrated across 2 gameplays how this plane is a rather capable dive bomber in terms of it being used as an interceptor stroke fighter in given circumstances. In that it has a very powerful forward firing armament when the additional machine guns are equipped under wing, and this means that you can really hurt foes who are lured into going into a head to head with you. But at the same time there will be those fielding similar armament, particularly as you go up the battle ratings, who will be able to deliver damage to you just as easily as you can deliver damage to them. But in those circumstances you can switch into being a turn fighter for a limited period of time, staying in the horizontal to gain the upper hand and bring your foe down. It's not going to be the most ideal aircraft for acting as a fighter, and there are going to be significantly better aircraft out there. But when you see an enemy Dauntless in the skies and their pilot seems to be rather alert and wanting to take the fight to you, they can prove a rather daunting prospect to deal with. And so I've been TX141, and if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, as always ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.